Continuing with final, I wanted to talk about final and classes real quickly because there's a few little interesting things. So first of all, one thing that we might have in our class is minimum and maximum values for our private variables. And final is a good thing to actually create those minimum and maximum values. So let's say, let's get into an idea of this. Let's say that our minimum and maximum values for ellipse width is well 0, and then the maximum value is maybe like whatever the width of the screen is, right, or something like that. Okay. And so we could go through our code and we could hard code 0 and the width of the screen every time we check the ellipse width and make sure it's within those bounds. Okay. But that might get annoying after a while, right? And so what's better to do is to create an ellipse upper bound final variable and an ellipse lower bound final variable. And what that says is, well, that won't change for the run of this program. That'll stay the same, okay? And so we'll make the check on it using those variables. And it will be easier then if we want to change the minimum and maximum bounds on the ellipse width, just to change that one variable at the top. We won't have to go through the whole code and change it in a few different places. For example, we might change it in the setter and the constructor, right? And we talk a little about how you're not supposed to call the setter from the constructor in Java. It's actually bad practice. People will do it, but you're not supposed to, okay? And so in that case, you're checking the bounds to make sure that in the constructor, the ellipse is the right width. And then you're also checking it in the setter to make sure that the ellipse is the right width before you set it, okay? And then what ends up happening is if you make a change, you have to change it in 2 places, okay? So that's one thing, is to make stuff that's not going to change through the run of your program final, okay? So it just stays constant. Once it's set, it's that way through the whole run of the program. For this particular run, it's going to stay that whatever it's set to, okay? And the other thing that ends up happening is sometimes people will make these types of variables final, right? Ellipse width and ellipse height. And those we might not know until the person passes it into the constructor. So what this is saying is this thing is not initialized, right? And it's not initialized. So what we have to do is we are forced to initialize it in the constructor. So if we say ball, I'm going to say xy, vx, vy, ellipse width, and ellipse height, right? And then we could say ellipse width equals EW, and ellipse height equals EH, okay? And so now these are final. They have to be set in the constructor if they're final, okay? But once they're set in the constructor, they're that way for that particular ball the whole time, okay? So let's understand what that means in terms of us creating balls. So let's say we create a ball, all right? So we have a ball, okay? And we create this ball with ball, and then, 50-50, so it's given the point of 50-50. And we wouldn't do that, right? We would always do it in terms of ellipse width, and in terms of the width and height of the screen, but we're just being easy right now. And it's going 1-1, and velocity x and velocity y, and 30-20, okay? Or 30-30, I'm sorry. 30-30, and that 0 looks terrible. Okay? So what this is saying is that this thing is going to be, so once you come up with an ellipse width and ellipse height for a particular ellipse, right, for a particular ball, all right, so let's say this is ball A equals that, right, new ball, whatever, right, we're invoking the constructor. Then it won't change, all right, so it means that ellipse width and ellipse height will stay constant, okay? That means in the middle, the ball won't suddenly become bigger, okay? And if that's the behavior we want, well, that's what we'll do, all right? And just to make this even more clear, we could have final int width height max, okay? And we can make that equal to, well, the width and height max, we would say maybe it's the width over 10, right? We don't want it much bigger than that, all right? And we could say final int width height min, and we could say that equals 0, all right? And actually, when you do finals, if you're doing finals, there is a rule of thumb, and the rule of thumb is you make these capital. So width, height, max. And you use these underscores instead of camelbacks. I don't know why. It's like a C++ thing. Every time something was a constant in C++, they would do this. And you define them at the very top. It's not to width, height, min. The reason I think it's kind of better to define them down here is because they're relating to the variables ellipse width and ellipse height, and so it kind of makes more sense because if you read something like width height max at the top and you don't even know that there's an ellipse width and an ellipse height, you're like, what is this constant doing, right? And so it's maybe better to in fact do it this way. Have the variable first and then have the stuff later so that when someone else tries to modify your ball, they kind of have an idea of what's going on, okay? We could also make these capital, but they're not being set immediately. And so I don't think it's as useful to make them all capital. But you could just always make all final variables capital. That's totally fine. It's just different philosophies. I gotta tell you the truth. Like, if you go on Stack Overflow, there's gonna be like 9 different people saying 9 different things on these things. So, whatever. Just come up with one that works. Like this works, right? And if you work at a company, they'll have their own policy, and you just gotta go with that. All right. Oh yeah. So then we do something like, oh wow, it's gonna happen again. And then he just sneezed for 5 hours. So we could say, you know, if EW is greater than ellipse height, God, what a terrible name for a variable, is greater than width height min, right? So if the value they pass in is greater than width height min, and the value they pass in is less than width height max, right? So as long as it's less than or those, or maybe it's less than or equal to, right? Greater than or equal to, then we set it, right? We set EW, okay? Well, what happens if that isn't the case, right? We are forced in final world to the last place. We have to either initialize it up here, or we have to initialize it in the constructor. We're not given any other choice. So it has to be initialized. So if it's not initialized, if they don't pass in a valid value, let's say they pass in -5 for the width, well, we're less than width height min, we're not going to initialize it. So now we have to initialize it to something. And so what we typically do is we will have a default value in this case. and our default value will be final. And that'll be, hey, if someone tries to make an ellipse as negative, we're going to make the ellipse some general value, okay? Or you could throw an error. But otherwise, we don't know about throwing errors yet. So we're just going to come up with a default value. And so default ellipse dim equals 30. All right. And then we could say otherwise ellipse width equals default ellipse dim. Okay. And so pretty soon what we have here is a case where we could be like, oh, wait a second, 0 makes no sense because we can't actually see that ellipse. So our min should be 5, okay? And then someone comes along and says, wait a second, maybe we want our min to be 20 for this particular program, okay? Now you just change it up here, and it's basically changed everywhere, right, that you have this. So you don't have to go through the code and find these specific statements and change them. You can suddenly just change it in one place and it changes everywhere else, which is convenient, right? So it's meant to not be changed during the run of the program, right? And then, when a ball is created with that value, it just will stay the same for that particular ball, okay? If it's final and for example, the ellipse width will stay the same for a particular ball. You won't change sizes in the middle according to this program, right? Because we made them final. And then the other thing is we can define some of these constants at the top, and then it makes it easier for us to change them, to put limits on these variables, right? And the default value, we can change that. So then we could be like, okay, if they don't pass anything in, we want to make it 40 now. It's really easy to change it. Think of a program where we have gravity, right? And we're creating a game where it's like a realistic game where you're dropping the ball on stuff, okay? And so you're dropping a ball from a certain height and trying to get it into cups or something like that, okay? And then later on, someone comes along and is like, oh yeah, we need to do a similar game, but this time it's going to be on the moon, right? Who did that? Mario did that. Angry Birds did that. Everyone's got to have a space game eventually. If you've got the franchise for long enough, the space game is coming. And so, since it's on the moon, we got to change the gravity. Well, if our gravity is just a final variable at the top, it is the most trivial thing in the world. And we'll see that when we do a project on acceleration. So hopefully that makes sense. Final is pretty straightforward. I hope you understand it. It's a constant, right? You could, once you set it, you can't set it again, okay? So it's a variable, you can only set it once, okay? If you're in a class and your variable is labeled final, you can either set it immediately or you have to set it in the constructor. You have no other choice. You have to either set it immediately or set it in the constructor. And the things we will use final for in our classes is for things like items, state variables that we don't want to change of a certain object. So in the ball case, we wanted the ellipse width to stay the same, and so we would make that final, for example, in this case. And also for our limits, right, on kind of in that same vibe, for our limits and our default values, where they'll be the same for every object, right? So we can make those final too, all right? And we will talk more about that soon enough.